Please take your seats. Our next our next panel will begin. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Liz Judd, and I'm a program officer on the NPD team. Today's panel will focus on a discussion around the lessons learned from the pandemic. Each panel member will share their lessons learned, starting with Dr. Andrea Hellman from Missouri State University, followed by Dr. Trish Marita Mullaney from Purdue University, and last but not least, Dr. Lynn Smoland from the University of Akron. Once everyone has spoken, we will open up for questions to be addressed by the panel. There are a few microphones in the audience, as you all have seen. Excuse me. And we will use to help capture the questions as they come in. At this time, we'll hear from Dr. Hellman, followed by Dr. Marita Mullaney and Dr. Smoland. Thank you.
Sorry. Well, I need to pull this up a little further. I think you're good, right? Can you hear me? Yes. Well, welcome back. My name is Andrea Hellman, and I will be talking about, I will be actually building on the last presentation, as in particular, the interview that the teacher gave about what happened during the first year of COVID. I think about my presentation as talking about the tail spinning of equity during the first year of the pandemic and the story of that and what we learned. And mainly my main concern is that we may not have learned the lesson what we didn't notice, and that we didn't learn some important lessons that we really need to learn from reflecting on that experience. And to show you what I mean, I'd like to take you back a little bit to March 2020. And that time we were into the fourth year of our very successful IELTS Ozarks project. And we were just about taking the baseline assessment for the quasi-experimental study that we were going to carry out in the fall. We've already tested our students, and here's my wonderful evaluator, Jimena Uribe-Zarrain, who's very much part of this talk with me. We were measuring what students were gaining in a semester when they already had teachers who had trained with us, whom we have observed and deemed to be effective teachers for English learners. So this was the time for us to really show what the outcome was of our project, of all our efforts. And instead, what happened, school closed down in March. And the initial reaction was, what is happening? And Itzet, our wonderful program officer, called us right away and said, what can I do to help? And I said, well, don't worry, Itzet, everything's fine. We are online, our professional development online. We can work online with our advisory board. Our team meetings are online. We are going strong. And then I remembered that our project isn't about us training teachers. Our project was about student outcomes. And so all of a sudden, at the very end of the logic model was that there will be growth. So I said, no, everything isn't fine. And I have to find out how everything isn't fine at all. But it wasn't obvious. So the data points that I'm talking about today, all were taken in the year of 2020. The first set just was April, just as soon as schools closed, and the end of March until April, based on Zoom discussions and discussion boards of our participants. The second set was an explanatory mixed methods design study. The third was a Qualtrics survey that was nationwide, and the fourth was a follow-up survey to our exploratory study. Our goal was really to document what's happening and to preserve evidence. because we really needed to know what is going to happen to student outcomes. And I'm trying to, oh, am I pointing the right direction? There you are. So you have this presentation that you can download and see the highlights of our findings. So here I will only maybe just very briefly tell you what concerned us right away. So at that time, we had 57 in-service teachers who we are talking to. Either they were in practicum or TESOL coursework. And they were all telling us when they came back from spring break, that they couldn't connect with caregivers, that the students were missing from the available instruction at a very high rate, that the student lacked the infrastructure for online learning. The teachers reported they were expecting a massive loss of instructional time, that the EL teachers were left to figure things out for themselves. They got absolutely no directions from their administrators. And in fact, the administrators were looking for them to solve every kind of problem, just like the assistant principal reported in the video that you saw from Ohio. And then EL specialists, all of a sudden, they weren't teaching. They spent all of their time plugging holes and trying to reach people and communicate and hook them up to learning and getting them hotspots, if that. At the time, I brought up, well, why don't we visit the students at home? And that was not only shut down, teachers were punished who attempted to carry out home visits. And without knowing what the conditions were in the home, it was impossible to help these families. And so several teachers reported that they were disciplined for attempting a home visit. But what they could do is get on the school bus and deliver supplies and food, and then tour the neighborhoods where the students were living to even get a sense of what the infrastructure is in those neighborhoods. So I was at the verge of an ethical dilemma with that, because all of a sudden I'm recording identifiable information. And when I only have 57 teachers in the program, obviously partner districts that I'm working with, there's an issue with documenting your hardships when those reflect on your partners. So my evaluator, Jimena Urbezain, and I talked quite a lot about how we can preserve evidence without jeopardizing confidentiality with our partners and the basis of our relationship. And so that's why we decided to do a case study of an unnamed state, which we proposed an exploratory mixed methods design study that started with a survey, and then went to an interview, and then we did document analysis and documented websites and all the help that was available to English learners in that state. So it's an unnamed state with initially 112 participants invited. Teachers wanted to talk to us. There was a very high return rate. We had a 50% return rate on our survey because everybody wanted to tell us what was going on. But I'm just bringing the ethical dilemma to you. When something happens with your project, you do have to protect all of your participants. And you may have to do other types of studies to document what's happening in your state so you don't jeopardize your partnership. What we found out after the study is that 27% of teachers reported that their schools had any sort of provision for English learner families. The remaining teachers didn't have any plans for English learners from their administrators. We found out that only 38% of teachers were able to communicate with at least one caregiver of every EL. So the remaining teachers were not. We found out that this was only possible through phone calls and texting and the WhatsApp. We found out that 57% of the teachers were able to communicate with every EL student at least once a week. The rest of them were not. 62% of teachers reported that fewer than half of their ELs could access the internet for an extended period of time. 45% teachers said that fewer than half of their ELs had a computer in the household. 36% of teachers said that fewer than half of their ELs had a tablet or smartphone with internet access. Nobody was recording attendance. and teachers felt distressed and powerless. And when we interviewed them, we found out that this was due to the extended learning opportunity policy that districts used in order not to be liable for not providing the same type of education for everyone. They use the very same policy that is designed to help vulnerable students catch up and get additional instruction to allow them not to participate in instruction. For them, summer school started. For the rest of while the rest of the students stayed in class with their parents sitting next to them for their online sessions. So this is not what we were hoping to see. Teachers said, and this kind of summarizes the interviews that we had with teachers. I didn't manage to cope. There was a lot of frustration, and the people who are in my boat continue to choose not to listen. I have done what I could to communicate with them what was happening, and hopefully that will guide and direct the conversation as we go forward. It is sad that the people who will be hurt by that are the students we didn't do our very hardest to ensure were reached. But no one planned for COVID, no one planned for extended school closures, and I do believe they were just doing what they thought was best. But at the same time, every blaring weakness that every district had was shown to the nth degree because those weaknesses we've all been silently whispering about became blaringly obvious. So whether it was lack of parent communication, whether it was lack of communication in general, whether it was lack of instruction that was applicable to the student, whatever it was blaringly obvious. So, and I will talk later about how we try to solve this problem by creating a theory of action and creating an action plan that solves for students missing from instruction. But before I get there, I just want to say what our follow-up data points were. So in November 2020, 104 teachers, 104 people responded to this national online survey, and 99 of them were classroom teachers of ELs. And in that, I presented about 25 different problems and asked the teachers to rate which one was a very serious or definite challenge for them. And the number one challenge for teachers in the fall of 2020 was that some of their EL students were in virtual instruction. So virtual instruction, even after they were given tools to try to participate, was simply inadequate for the EL students in the fall of 2020. The second was that the students didn't have reliable internet access that could support their video conferencing. That was 63% of teachers, EL teachers were struggling with that. That they were still having trouble connecting with EL caregivers. 60% of teachers were still struggling to connect with caregivers. They had more roles and responsibilities that they had in prior year. They were having trouble contacting English learner students, 54% of teachers. But the school teaching plan didn't include English learners, again, in fall 2020, right? So what schools learned in the spring, they implemented the same thing in the fall. In fact, they didn't learn that their EL students were missing from instruction. They didn't plan for emergency school closing. And I haven't taken any data points since then, but I still would like to see the school that has an emergency school closing plan that is suitable for English learners, that involve their families in the creation of that plan. So then we did a follow-up study that we wanted to find out if things have gotten better in the fall after all the summer there was to plan. And there was no longer the extended learning opportunity policy because districts weren't allowed to apply that. So under those conditions, 35% were teaching face-to-face as a main form of instruction. So a lot of schools decided to give up on online learning and went back to face-to-face. But 22% of them were still sending packets home, or they were on a hiatus from their subject area, right? And the rest of them were online. So at this, remember in the spring that 27% of them made any provisions at all for else. In the fall, it was 28% that made any provisions for else. Nothing changed. The same thing happened, except 56% were able to communicate with at least one caregiver every EL. So that was up from 38% in the spring to 56%. 32% were able to communicate with every EL every day, and 20% were able to communicate with every EL several times a week, and the rest of them were not. So teachers were now reported being overwhelmed by prep time from the hybrid instruction, teaching face-to-face and virtually at the same time with the quarantine students. They lacked social interaction. And the only positive thing that they reported was that they were finally able to see their students. So these were the conditions that we heard. My student, who's a 14-year-old girl from Guatemala, whose first language is an indigenous language, arrived weeks after the school year started. I had difficulty communicating with her because she has beginning proficiency in Spanish. She had spent several months in an immigration facility at the border, so she was very fearful the first time we met. When she began her English language proficiency assessment, it became clear that this was the first time she used a computer. She experienced moving the cursor with the mouse like a game of magic. She's the sweetest person and very committed to her education. Because of her circumstances, she opted for virtual instruction this year. So that was our #1 challenge, English language learners in virtual instruction. Then another one, this family has 3 children, a kindergartner, a 4th grader, and a 6th grader. The parents opted for online school this year, but they do not seem to understand the importance of regular attendance. There's not a clear understanding that this school year is different from what we had last spring from March to May. Despite our efforts to communicate the expectations that regular Zoom attendance is a requirement and will impact the students' grades, all 3 children struggle collectively with online attendance as well as turning in assignments. And then another condition is a typical condition of what happened under virtual instruction. There are 15 students on my roster for my secondary sheltered ELA class. Currently, 3 of them are attending regularly online. I try to call every day for the other students, but either the parents are not answering the phone or they are getting angry that I keep calling. I understand that refugee parents have lost work and they are depending on their children to support the family. The expectation of a good child is that they will step up to the task and do whatever is needed for the family. So I would just like to make a few closing remarks because my time is running out. But what if we planned for COVID, right? The problem is we didn't plan for COVID. We didn't give these children a voice. We didn't give these families a voice in what they can do and what they can't do. But what if we did? We did have emergency school closing plans with provisions for English language learners. And if you have those, I'd love to see them because I'm still waiting. And what if we gave voice to multilingual families who attend the school in the creation of that plan and made provisions that fit their capabilities? What if we trained everyone for their role during an emergency school closing? What if we set aside the appropriate resources needed to carry out that plan? What if we developed two-way communication with families before an emergency? What if we engaged everyone to boost their participation and their attendance and worked with them to find their solutions? What if we prioritized vulnerable students and anticipated what we can do to enable them to manage? I think what we learned is that change is the most difficult to our most vulnerable students and their families, that their voice is the smallest in an emergency. They weren't protesting, they weren't on the street, they weren't calling legislators, they simply disappeared, voiceless. They can become invisible in an instant. and their hard-earned equity can slip away unnoticed during a school closing emergency. And they will take the longest to recover from the crisis. So I'm trying to urge us to, I give you logic model. You can download it from the app that Jimena and I worked on in the summer of 2020 to try to create a process for how we solve for this problem that multilingual learners lost access to education disproportionately because we did not have a plan for them or with them on the school level. So I'd like to urge us, all of us, to collectively put our heads together and find a logic model that solves for this problem, a theory of action that we collectively can promote. All right, I think that's the theory of action that you can download as a separate file. And I guess the fastest way for our students to lose equity is by not being able to participate in the form of instruction that is being offered. And whatever the reason for the disconnect, whatever the reason for the disconnect, the result is the same. Whether it's the lack of two-way communication between families and the schools, whether it's the lack of attendance, whether it's the unscaffolded use of technology, whether it's incomprehensibility of the teacher, whether it is the unsuitability of the learning materials, whether it's a lack of resources, whether it's barriers raised by school boards and politicians, no matter the cause, the result is the same. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you, boys and girls. Sorry, it's my elementary teacher coming out of me. So, a good afternoon. My name is Trish Marita Mullaney, and I'm from Purdue University, which is in the heartland of Indiana. And I recognize that in March of 2020, our state went to emergency remote learning and teaching, or teaching and learning like most of us did. But we resumed school in August of that same year. And I realize that that's not the same condition for every state in the room. So I'm here to talk to you about several things, but just a quick overview of our project. We have 5 school partners throughout the state, 5 school districts that we work with across 2 different NPD projects from 2017. One called Leveraging the Lectura y Lenguaje, which is working with general education elementary teachers, making them be good 3rd grade teachers for emergent bilinguals. And then we have Project Puede, which is Parental Understanding for Equity and Dual Language Education, working with a smaller set of dual language educators, a growing phenomenon in our state. And since we started our project, there are now 40 dual language programs in the heartland. And in even looking at this picture, I'm realizing the impact of COVID to the leaders in this picture. Some have gone back to the classroom, and some have moved on to administrative roles. So one of the things that will happen for those of you that are new to this, in 5 years, stuff happens, right? Crisis happens. COVID was a pretty big one, but there are lessons learned from that. So this is one of our directors workshops that we held annually. This was our first one, and then our following ones, of course, moved virtually. So here's March 12th. I am at the Meijer store doing my grocery shopping because I've heard about this thing called COVID. And I know this because my husband is a scientist and he says it's coming. I also know this from my evaluator who lives in Asia, in Hong Kong, and he says it's coming. And so I wrote here, I just needed eggs, COVID-19 coronavirus update, right? So at the time this was trending big, and you can see that the lines are forming. And then my phone begins to blow up because you start hearing about all of these immediate school closures. And so I say, and this is with Dr. Jennifer Wren, who is our senior project manager, who's over here. And I said, yikes, we should start collection now. And then Jen says, Ming was right. Here it comes. What are schools saying? Waiting to hear. It's not looking good, right? So we were literally planning the calendar for our end of year collection, where we were collecting data in about 40 classrooms throughout the state. And that quickly came to a halt. And we obviously weren't able to reach the aims of our randomized control trial. It was kind of a randomized chaos trial as we moved through what RCT met with cancellations. So today I'm going to review for you what we did across our 2 projects in 4 distinct areas with our community partners, which is a part of our family engagement component, research, teaching with our in and pre-service teachers, and coaching. And let's take a look. So this is before the pandemic. So this is some of our school partners, our community agencies that were located in different locations of the state. And so we were able to use Zoom before we knew that we'd be using it every single day. So you can see that we're here collaborating with our partners, La Plaza and an international center up in Northern Indiana, and also meeting with their district representatives. So this was done at the very, very beginning of our project. And before the pandemic, we were able to capture what was going on in the homes of our emergent bilingual families. What we did is we did questionnaires, we did audio interviews, which our community centers helped us with. And then we actually went into the home to capture the phenomenon of what was going on in those homes, which actually prepared us for the content that we were able to implement in year 2 of our project. So the benefit came to our in-service teachers in year 2. And that's when we started our work with in-service teachers. Again, this is all before COVID. So there were some lessons learned before COVID that helped us manage the pandemic. During the pandemic, we were able to bring in, I'm sorry that I keep hitting that. We were able to bring in this content with video vignettes that we captured of our families doing different by literacy, multimodal type activities in the home. We were able to capture those. And this was actually integrated into our project in the very start of the spring of 19. We did it again in spring of 2020. And the protocol that we went through, we actually engaged our in-service teachers in duplicating that protocol and going out and meeting with a family from their classroom that they got to know immersively. And thankfully, they were able to have this experience before COVID hit. Because these videos are extant and we got them before COVID, they continue to be a part of our project. And so each year when we have a new cohort, they're able to see these videos that are representative of their communities, which is a really important part of the critical consciousness and dual language, the 4th pillar, which is about historicizing and localizing the needs of given emergent bilingual communities. So you'll see an example here. So before the pandemic, so here we are, we're the dream team. Actually, there needs to be more people in here, but we happened to grab this. This is Annie Garcia, our project manager. And we had a very, very organized research protocol around a particular intervention related to oral language vocabulary and interaction in the classroom. So we did training, we had a rubric developed. We had a filming criterion that was very strict. We had a teacher camera, we had a student camera, we had a process for consent and assent from the children and the teachers. And we had a team of 3 in each of the classrooms. We had a red team and a blue team, right? And we got there well before the process started, usually an hour to 90 minutes. We conferred with the teachers, the administrators, the EL directors. We all did background checks beforehand, right? And it was because one district requested it, we did it for everybody. That really showed our due diligence that we wanted to be good partners and to be in good standing with them. We then reviewed the rosters of teachers and students, and we identified the ELs in the classroom. We also identified those that had not consented to the study. And you'll see some visuals of that here. So the photo on the left is my dog Pongo, who is one of the mascots. There's many fur mascots in our project, but you can see here that this is our equipment. We've got our little teacher crate, but we also have Team Blue, and you can see all of the camera equipment inside. We also named every camera, so that's Lolita. That's the camera. So we knew if we were doing Team Blue that we had Lolita in our bag. And then we would have like a backup, like Senor Lolito would be like the backup. And then we have different colors to highlight the rosters to designate who had assented, who had not. So you can see the roster pointed out there, but this is us in the field. I think I'm working on a microphone to make it work. So that was really organized, and then schools closed, right? And so we had to pivot. And what are we going to do? We're still going to collect data when people return to classrooms in the fall. And so 4 out of our 5 districts allowed us to come in following local mandates, which shows the importance of having a really outstanding relationship with them. We did COVID testing before we went in. We captured observations by one camera, and then the rubric conferral happened afterwards on campus with the team. And in the one district where we weren't allowed to come in, we didn't have to convince her. We asked her, would you be willing to go through IRB training? And she said yes, and she did it. And she kept through the videos for us. That was an Yale director that helped us out. We also conducted a teacher attitude and ideology interview before the pandemic. We actually did that in person between observations, but now we had to do it on Zoom. But we found that it was a really humanizing therapy for them, that they actually had someone to talk to about what was really going on. And for a lot of them, because we weren't necessarily a person from within, like a principal or a colleague, they were really able to let down, and we really got into their hearts and their souls of everything that was going on for them as they mapped onto COVID. Instruction before the pandemic, our whole program is online. It's intensive. It can be done in 12 months, and we do our courses in 8-week modules or 8-week segments. So we use very interactive features such as VoiceThread, blogging. Our learning management system is Brightspace. So this is what it looked like right at the onset of COVID, and then during the pandemic, it looked exactly the same. Right? Because if it was online, we didn't have to pivot in that way. What it did impact, though, was how people were able to do their field experiences, because they would do them in their own classrooms with the English learners, the emergent bilinguals in their classroom. And so what we had to do, particularly during ERDL, where there was nothing that they could observe, is we pivoted and we used an ELPS, it's called the English Language Learner Portrait, I don't know. Anyway, but you can see it right there. And this is something that Dr. Wright has developed that shows these portraits of emergent bilinguals and their different language productions across different domains and different social purposes. So we adapted our course discussions. And so we did ask questions related to ERDL and how things were being impacted by that. So you can see a quote here from one of our teachers. When I was reading your comment, I remembered myself teaching via Zoom during the pandemic. I also realized I relied a ton on informal evaluation with students. In the real classroom, we always see everybody. Well, in Zoom, not all students even turn on their cameras, which makes it frustrating to not only assess, but to even lead the class. And so these were some of the dynamics, the nuggets that were pulled out. And as a result, we were able to adapt and work with them through those challenges. Before the pandemic, our coach observed teachers during their language arts block using an instructional interaction rubric, and she did this 4 times during the year. She discussed the interaction individually or in groups by grade level with teachers. And then she also collaborated with them to commit to a future nugget for interaction, right? Which meant it was really differentiated for each teacher. And then also to bring in captures, so almost like a photo voice process where you took in photos of instructional materials and artifacts. But during the pandemic, right, what would happen is we would upload the videos into a secure portal, which the coach would watch before she would coach our teacher candidates virtually. And she would do that through Zoom. So it was a little bit of a slower process, but definitely made it more accessible. And again, the future commitment was like, what are you going to do given that you have these restrictions of social distancing or having a hybrid model, which we had in some of our districts where some kids were coming in on the screen via Zoom and others were in the classroom. And then we also, she also invited them to take a photo of their learning space and what it looked like during ERDL. And then we also engaged our coach in interviewing previous cohorts that had gone through the program with us before COVID, and then asking them specifically, how did things change for them during remote teaching? And then if they were back in school, what were they doing given socially distanced conditions? Because when you have a rubric on interaction and the kids have to be separated between plexiglass, it can be done, but there are particular challenges. So here are some pictures of our teachers in the remote working space. It may be really difficult to see, but the photo on the left is great. We have all of these notes from like the mom, the teacher, like, you can do it, mom, right? And I love how her laptop's on top of a Lego box, right? You can see there, she got a Lego box. She's got a couple of cups of coffee going, right? So, but this is really fascinating because we saw the diversity of what was going on. The photo on the right, you can clearly see that here is a mom that is teaching, logged into Brightspace and trying to do her schoolwork while her children are being taught virtually as well. And you can see that she has 3 kids and her dog, and they're all spread out. She pulled out a card table and just made her living room the classroom space for families. So that's how Purdue responded to the pandemic. So I would like to thank my team, which are over here. There's Team Purdue. I'm the principal investigator. My co-PIs, Dr. Wayne Wright, Dr. Jennifer Wren, and Annie Garcia, PhD candidate with us, and our project manager. We have a QR code up here, so you can go ahead and take a shot of that. This will take you to all the things that I talked about. They're all hyperlinked in there for you. Thank you.
Yeah. Point the screen. Okay. Just make sure. What am I doing wrong? This. What am I doing wrong?
I don't think it's live yet.
We did that. At the guys on the back.
No, I think that.
Is there a lock signal? Or?
It looks like they're troubleshooting.
Yeah, they're trying to fix it. It's not working. Just a minute. Okay. That's theater sign language.
That's right.
That's theater. Just like this?
Yeah. Jazz hands.
Those are jazz hands. Okay, she's saying, try it.
Oh, okay. Okay,
There you
perfect.
go. You're working.
Okay, thank you. All right. Okay, so very nice to have all of you here. I am Dr. Lynn Smolin. I am Professor Emerita from the University of Akron. I taught there for 35 years, developed the bilingual program as well as the TESOL program, and developed all the courses in both programs and taught them for 35 years. And it's my great pleasure to be here. I'm very in awe of these 2 ladies who've just presented. They did amazing things. I did less because I just recently took over as the director. Before this, as a retired professor, I was just doing one component of our research, which was one-on-one coaching with a segment of the teachers who are participating in our grant. So our grant is called Northeast Ohio Achieve. And we've had two different national professional development grants, each of them 5 years. The first one focused on content teachers, mostly middle school and high school teachers, and also special education teachers. One of the professors on our grant is a specialist in special education, so that was really very helpful for our first grant. Our second grant, the one that we have right now, of course, has been focused on early childhood. And we had a switch in the directors of the grant. First, we had Dr. Sherdavaz Bakil, and then we have, of course, me. So I came in sort of at the tail end of, so I didn't experience all of the pandemic, but I have a lot to share anyway. So, so what did our grant team learn from the pandemic? Huh? Oh no, not again. Please don't do this again. Thank you. Okay, so how did our grant make modifications for the data collection? All right, so our first goal was to improve effective instruction for English learners in the NEOA grant by increasing the number of teachers and administrators who earn the TESOL endorsement. One of the problems that we had once the pandemic hit was the fact that the schools in Northeast, well, basically all of Ohio, did not do testing. They didn't do the state testing or the benchmark testing. And so for the calendar year of 2020, and as a result, our evaluation team was not able to access achievement data for school year 2020, rather 2019, 2020, and also was not able to access the testing for 2020 to 2021. So that, of course, we had to make some modifications in terms of what kind of data we were collecting. Obviously, we couldn't use the testing data, but we were able to use other alternative kinds of online, like pre and post surveys and so forth. So we were able to get some data, but not what we had been planning for. Also, we had some difficulty because we were doing pre and post observations of teacher lessons and using the SIAP protocol that and the reason we were using that was because our program, our teacher training on how to teach English as a second language was based on the SIAP model. We have had one course that is entirely having the teachers learn both by discussions and readings, but also by actual practice teaching in their classroom how to use the SIAP model effectively. So one course focused on that. But we also have throughout our 19 graduate credit hours, we have the SIAP model threaded throughout. We have 2 linguistics courses that emphasize the teaching of academic language and the components of academic language that are important for teachers to teach. And so, of course, that directly connects with the SIAP model. Plus, we have a literacy course and we have a regular TESOL course. We have a practicum and so forth. So in all of those components, the teachers learn how to use the SIOP model effectively. They, in some of the courses, they develop a full SIOP lesson that they videotape, and then they reflect on, and they discuss with the other teachers in the class. So it was really important for us to have that pre-post teachers lessons. What we did for those pre-post teacher lessons, those observations, was a team of us would go to, a small team of us would go to a classroom, and we would observe the teacher's lesson. And then we would use the SIOP protocol to evaluate the teacher's lesson. For example, did they use objectives? Did they use language objectives and content objectives? And did they build background knowledge for their lesson, and so forth and so on? That was going very well. And what we were trying to get at was, were they learning the SIOP model effectively, and were they actually implementing it in the classroom? Because we all know that often teachers can learn all the information in a class, but they don't necessarily transfer that knowledge to the actual implementation in their own classroom. So we wanted to know if that really was happening. So we would do a pre-test before they ever had any instruction. So they hadn't had any training in our program at the pre, and then at the post, they would have had all of the coursework and plus the practicum. And so that went very well for the first couple of years of our program. And then suddenly we couldn't do it anymore because in Ohio, we were not allowed. Every state is different, I know that. But in Ohio, we were not allowed to go into the school buildings. And the teachers were not yet, March 2020, the teachers were not yet online with the students. They were still struggling to figure out what the heck they're going to do at that point in the year. So we weren't able to do the pre-observations. So that changed. Okay. Just a minute. There we go. Okay. So the evaluation team's response to these challenges were that they developed and administered a COVID-19 impact teacher survey in the fall of 2020 to gather data on how the teachers adjusted to the pandemic environment. And basically what we learned from that was what all of you already know, and these two wonderful ladies have presented, all the challenges. Challenges such as, trying to learn new technology, trying to implement it, trying to get the students, to actually show up to class, and, to have their whatever technology they had, if they had a Chromebook or an iPad or whatever, to actually remember to charge it so that they could use it the next day, and so forth and so all those kinds of issues. So that was a real insight into looking at what some of the things that the teachers were going through. In our particular situation, we had participants who actually had family members that died. And, so there were a lot of family issues amongst our participants that they were struggling with. And so it was extremely important that we would be supportive of them. Our evaluation team also collected perception data while the teachers adjusted to the COVID-19 environment. That, again, gave us some insight into some of the kinds of adjustments and the lack of support expecting teachers to do more than they had before, expecting teachers to solve the problems, administrators just kind of saying, well, you know, you solve it kind of thing. One of the issues that we saw happening was that in the school districts, they sent out materials to the homes to guide to help the parents with the problems of not having technology or not having an internet connection or whatever. The schools did provide that. The problem was that the materials that they brought, they didn't last. So, you know, a kid might have some of the packet that, you know, where he has the markers and the printouts and so forth that he has to have, but he might have that 1 week and then suddenly it's disappeared. So a lot of times what was happening was that the teachers were having to make home visits to deliver more materials to certain families. And so we got that kind of insight into that from these perception data collected by our evaluation team. One thing that we were able to do in terms of evaluation and data collection is that the team was able to administer the pre and post survey to the grant's teacher participants without interruption. And basically what that pre and post test, post survey rather, was designed to do, and we've been doing this since the first year of our implementation of our grant with our participants. That survey was designed to find out what the teacher's perception was of the courses. And, you know, like, you know, were they learning what they were supposed to be learning and so forth? And did they feel that it was being effectively delivered and so forth and so on? And so we were able to continue with that survey during the pandemic, which was, you know, very beneficial to still have that insight into the program itself. One of the things that was beneficial about that was because, as I mentioned before, there was for 2 years, we didn't get any testing data because the schools were not testing the kids. So there was no way that we could get that hard data. But at least we got some insight into how the students were progressing through their responses to the pre and post surveys. So I think it's important to remember, if you're new to a grant project, that it's really important to think ahead, to plan ahead, you know, think, well, you know, we need to have a variety of different types of ways of collecting data, because if some way, for some reason, we can't collect data, we need to have a fallback situation. What are we going to do if this happens? Is there any way, you know, to be more flexible in how you collect data? Okay, here we go again. Okay. So goal 2 was to strengthen the TESOL courses with the research-based practices in literacy, parent-family collaboration, and so forth. And this goal was not affected by the pandemic. And I just mentioned before that we had we redesigned our existing TESOL program to incorporate more of a SIOP focus. All right, goal 3, the grant will enhance meaningful relationships between schools, parents, family by implementing the learner-centered professional development model in select schools. That goal had been very successful in the previous years before the pandemic. And the schools had established a strong collaboration with their parents, and they met several times with the parent group throughout the year. And they all had a parent night in which, for example, in one school, this was the first year that we implemented the LCPD. The parent night was focused on math, and we had centers throughout the school where they taught the parents some of the activities that they could teach, that they teach their own children, and how could they support their children with their homework and so forth. So that was just one example of many of the other schools that, really was very, very effective in providing this opportunity to build stronger parent-school relationships. Unfortunately, it was impossible for, when the pandemic hit, it was impossible to continue that LCPD program. It was just, the schools were not allowing extra people coming in. So anybody like me, the university, I couldn't come into a school. And the problem was that the parents couldn't come in many of the schools. So it was, very restricted. So it was very difficult to do the LCPD program. Now, this past year, this is when I took over. This past year, the 2021, 2022. In this year, I have been working hard to encourage schools to participate in the LCPD program. Unfortunately, we had 2 districts that said that they were not interested in participating because they said the attitudes of the teachers, that the teachers had this burnout, that they were very reluctant to ask the teachers to do one extra thing. However, I successfully got involved in one of our school districts in Cuyahoga Falls, and worked hard to build a relationship with them. We established 2 schools that were willing to participate in the LCPD parent-school relationship program. And they were really, really interested, and they came up with a great plan. They decided, how can we improve the relationships with our parents? Well, one of the problems is communication. And even though they have a really nice website, for part of it for the parents and so forth, what they didn't have was a really good online communication with the parents. And so what they decided to do is to build, so they have developed a program for training the teachers, training the parents to use simple technology to communicate with the school, with the teachers, like Dogo and so forth. And so they were going to bring in interpreters to translate for the trainers that they were going to have. They would have one night in which you had all these different groups where the parents would come in, and they would be divided in groups according to the particular language. Oh, okay, so I'll go fast. So they would be divided into groups according to language. So you might have Spanish in one group, and Punjabi in another group, and so forth. They had a really great idea, and it was really going to be effective, and then suddenly they couldn't do it because one of the ESL teachers left at one of the schools. So they decided not to do it this year and to postpone it to the fall, which made it a little tough on us at the university level, but we figured it out and it's going to work. Okay, so, whoops, I went too far. Okay, so basically that's just saying that I worked with the two schools to administer. One of their data collections was parent survey and teacher survey. So we did that. And now we're going to do the LCPD in the fall. Okay, so what did we learn about handling the data collection during the pandemic? Well, although, let's see. Go to the next section. Let me just go to the next section because of time. So what we learned about modifying the grant activities during the pandemic. We learned that it's really important to be flexible, to realize that you're going to have some problems and you need to problem solve, you need to work as a collaborative team and come up with some answers for how you're going to go about that. You also need to build strong relationships with partner schools to make problem solving more feasible. All right, so here, what I mean is, and I can't emphasize this enough. When I say strong relationships, I don't mean getting on Zoom, and I don't mean sending somebody an email. I think the most important way to establish strong relationships with schools, or with anybody for that matter, is to have personal, in-person relationships established. For example, one of the projects that I was involved with in the grant was a one-on-one coaching of a subsection of the participants in the grant. And that was very personal, where I would work side by side with the teacher and pre-planning a lesson and then delivering the lesson. We would co-teach a lesson, and then we would follow it up by side by side, reflecting on the lesson. That was a very, very personal connection to the teachers. And it really gave me a great deal of insight into what they were going through. Now, what happened was that during the pandemic, I couldn't go side by side with the teachers because I couldn't even get into the school buildings. So we went online. And that was not as effective because I was a little bit more at a distance, and it was difficult to do co-teaching, but it still was effective. Next thing, be supportive and understanding with participating teachers. The pandemic was very, very challenging for classroom teachers, as you know. And what we did was try to be as flexible and understanding with the teachers as possible. So there were teachers who literally, because they had so much work to do at their own schools, they had difficulty completing some of their assignments. But the teachers who were teaching the courses, even though these were all online courses, of course, the teachers were much more understanding and more willing to be flexible about due dates and so forth. So I think that's a very, very important. And then be willing to make last minute changes in plans, even though this might not be ideal for the team. And the perfect example of that, of course, was with the LCPD program, with a parent and school relationship. That was an example of, having to really be willing to change plans, even though we had worked very hard to get the LCPD going this spring. We still have to postpone it to the fall. There's an example of how it's important to be willing to make those last minute changes. Okay, and that's what all I have to say. Do we have time for any questions if they're interested in doing questions? Past? Okay, cutting into the other one? Okay, all right. Okay, take into the break. Okay, well, thank you very much, folks.
Thank you so very much. We're supposed to be on break until when? Are there any no, that's one of ours. Okay, so break is supposed to be at 4 o'clock, return. So I guess we can do 5 more minutes, 4:05. Would that be okay? All right, so let us reconvene at 4:05. And if you do have any questions in regards to this, I'm sure that there's contact information in the agenda so that you can send an email.